The deed landed on the counter between them with a sound like a pistol shot, and Alberta Vaughn stared at it the way a woman stares at something she cannot quite believe is real. It was a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and the sun had barely cleared the ridge of the Cimarron Hills when Abel Hartwell walked into the dry goods store in Dusty Creek, Kansas, smelling of horses and pine resin and the wide-open Kansas plain. Alberta had been arranging bolts of calico fabric behind the counter, her dark hair pinned up beneath a practical cotton bonnet, her sleeves rolled to the elbows because Mrs. Prout, who owned the store, was away visiting her sister in Abilene, and Alberta was alone with the work and the dust and the quiet hum of her own thoughts. She had not expected company, certainly not company like Abel Hartwell, who stood 6 feet tall and wore a battered gray hat that had clearly survived more than a few Kansas storms. He set the folded paper down on the counter and looked at her with brown eyes that were direct and unhurried, the way a man looks when he has decided something and sees no reason to dress it up in ceremony. "Miss Vaughn," he said, "I want you to have this." Alberta looked at the paper without touching it. "What is it?" "Deed to the Hartwell homestead. 40 acres on the South Fork of the Cimarron, good water, solid house, barn that don't leak. I had it drawn up proper at the county office last Thursday." She looked up at him. She was 24 years old and had been in Dusty Creek for 14 months, having come west from Missouri after her father passed and left her with nothing but a carpet bag and the advice of a distant cousin who said there was work in Kansas. She had been careful with people since arriving. She had been careful with men especially. "You want me to have the deed to your homestead," she repeated slowly, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. "Yes, ma'am. I haven't said yes to anything, Mr. Hartwell." "No," he agreed, "you haven't." He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it beside the deed, turned it once in his hands and looked at her steadily. "But I mean to court you proper, Miss Vaughn, and I figure a woman ought to know what she's being asked toward before she decides whether the direction suits her." Alberta blinked. In all her 24 years, no man had ever handed her a deed to a property as a preliminary to courtship. Men in Missouri had offered flowers, or awkward Sunday dinners arranged by mothers who thought they were doing everyone a favor. She had received one marriage proposal from a clerk at the grain exchange who had offered her a glass ring and a life of ledger books, which she had declined with more politeness than she felt. But this was something else entirely. This was a man placing his most significant earthly possession on a dry goods counter and telling her in plain language that it was hers. She did not pick up the deed. "I think," she said carefully, "that you had better tell me why." Abel Hartwell settled into the look of a man who has rehearsed something, and then decided in the moment to say it differently. He set his hat on his head and leaned one arm on the counter with an ease that was either confidence or something more complicated. "My mother came west from Tennessee when she was 19, he said. "She came out with my father and they built that homestead from nothing. 3 rooms, then 5, then the barn. She worked that land alongside him for 12 years, and when he died of fever in 1871, she had nothing legal to show for it because his name was the only name on any paper. His brother came out from Tennessee with a lawyer and took everything inside of 6 weeks. My mother spent the last years of her life taking in washing in Caldwell, Kansas. The store was very quiet. Outside, a wagon rolled past on the main road and a dog barked twice and went silent. So that's why," Abel said. "I figure if a woman is going to share a life with a man, she ought to hold something real in her own name, not as a condition and not as a trick, just because it's right." Alberta Vaughn looked at Abel Hartwell for a long moment. She looked at the deed on the counter. Then she looked back at him. "That is," she said, "either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me, or the most elaborate scheme I have ever encountered." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was something adjacent to one. "I'm not a complicated man, Miss Vaughn. I run cattle, I fix what breaks, and I say what I mean." "Then I will say what I mean in return," she told him. "I don't know you, Mr. Hartwell, and I don't take property from strangers. Put the deed back in your pocket, and if you want to call on me, you may do so on Sunday afternoons when Mrs. Pruitt is here and the store is closed. You may bring conversation, and nothing more elaborate than a piece of pie from the hotel dining room, because I have found that elaborate gestures from men I don't know tend to carry weights I'm not prepared for. Abel took the deed from the counter and folded it back into his coat pocket without a flicker of wounded pride or irritation. He simply nodded, as if she had said something entirely reasonable, which she had. "Sunday afternoon," he said. "I'll be here." He put on his hat properly, touched the brim in a brief, courteous gesture, and walked out of the dry goods store into the bright Kansas morning. Alberta stood at the counter for a full 2 minutes after the door swung shut, and then she picked up the bolt of calico she'd been working with and went back to the shelving, because there was always more to do, and standing around thinking about brown eyes and homestead deeds was not going to get Mrs. Pruitt's store organized. But she thought about it anyway. She thought about it all the way through the afternoon inventory and the sweep of the front step and the careful counting of the week's receipts. She thought about his mother, the woman who had worked 12 years of her life into Kansas soil and walked away with nothing in her hands. She thought about the way Abel had said it, without drama, without expectation of sympathy, just as a fact that had shaped him into the kind of man who thought to put a deed on a counter before he thought to put flowers in a woman's hand. She had been in Dusty Creek for 14 months and had kept mostly to herself, working, saving, thinking. She had a particular kind of life in mind for herself, one where she was not at the mercy of circumstances she hadn't chosen. She was not opposed to love. She was simply careful about the paths that were supposed to lead to it. Abel Hartwell arrived on Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock precisely, with a piece of apple pie wrapped in a cloth from the hotel kitchen and his good hat, which was charcoal-colored and newer than the gray one he'd worn on Tuesday. Mrs. Pruitt was sitting in her rocking chair just inside the store with her knitting, performing a kind of aggressive neutrality that Alberta recognized as her version of a chaperone who planned to hear everything. Alberta had set 2 chairs on the store's small front porch because the afternoon was warm, and the porch caught a good breeze from the south. Abel sat across from her with his long legs stretched out at an angle, and ate his half of the pie with the unself-conscious straightforwardness of a man who was genuinely hungry and genuinely comfortable in his own skin, and Alberta found herself relaxing in increments she hadn't quite expected. She asked him about the homestead. He talked about it the way people talk about things they love, which is to say practically and specifically, describing the creek that ran along the south boundary, and the particular way the light came through the cottonwood grove in the early morning, and the fact that the well had never gone dry in the 7 years. He'd been working the land since his mother left, and he'd taken it back from his uncle through a legal process that had cost him 3 years of savings and a considerable amount of stubbornness. "You took it back from your uncle?" Alberta asked. "I did. Through the courts. Yes, my father had made a verbal agreement with me when I was 14 that the land would come to me. I had a letter he'd written to a neighbor that mentioned it. The judge in Caldwell was a fair man." He paused. "It was close, though. Another judge and I'd have lost." "How old were you when you went to court for it?" 21. She studied his face. He was 28 now, she had gathered from conversation with Mrs. Pruitt before Sunday, who knew most things about most people in Dusty Creek and its surroundings. 7 years of building what his parents had built, but with his name on the papers from the start, and now his intention to put a woman's name on those same papers before she had agreed to share the life that went with them. "Do you have family nearby?" she asked. "No family left. My mother passed in 1875. A cousin in Colorado I write to occasionally. That's the whole of it." He said it plainly, without the bid for sympathy that some men would have inserted into such a statement. "My father died 18 months ago," Alberta said. "My mother when I was 11. I have a brother in St. Louis who has a family of his own and no particular interest in adding to his responsibilities." She paused. I came to Dusty Creek because I needed to be somewhere new, somewhere that didn't already have its mind made up about who I was. Abel looked at her with a steadiness that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. Who were you supposed to be back in Missouri? Jacob Vaughn's daughter, she said, which meant practical and quiet and grateful for whatever came along because we didn't have much. I'm still practical and I can still be quiet, but I decided I wasn't going to be grateful for whatever came along. I was going to be particular. That seems right to me, he said simply. Mrs. Pruitt's knitting needles clicked steadily from inside the store. They talked for 2 hours. He told her about running cattle, the seasonal rhythms of it, the neighbors he trusted and the ones he didn't, the solitude that he'd come to appreciate and that also had its edges of loneliness he wouldn't deny. She told him about growing up in Columbia, Missouri, about learning to keep the books for her father's small mercantile business when she was 16 because he wasn't well even then and someone had to do it, about the strange freedom of coming west even though freedom and total uncertainty had looked remarkably similar in the beginning. When he left, he touched the brim of his hat and said he'd enjoyed the afternoon, and she said she had too, and it was simply the truth. The following Sunday he came back. And the one after that, by the 4th Sunday, Mrs. Pruitt had stopped pretending to knit and simply brought her chair out onto the porch with them, which Alberta privately found both amusing and touching, because it meant the older woman had decided they were worth supervising properly. Abel brought pie every week from the hotel kitchen. On the 5th Sunday, he also brought a small book, a collection of short stories from back east, and asked if she liked to read. When she said she loved to read but had limited access to books, he said he had a small collection at the homestead, and she was welcome to borrow them, and there was nothing in the offer but the offer itself. On the 6th Sunday it rained, and they sat inside the store with the door open to the smell of wet Kansas earth, and he told her about a trip he'd made to Denver in 1876 to sell a particularly good string of horses, and the city had struck him as extraordinary and exhausting in equal measure, and she laughed at the way he described the hotel he'd stayed in and the 5-course dinner that had baffled him completely. I ate the fish with the wrong fork, he said, and the waiter looked at me like I'd committed a crime. What did you do? I looked him straight back and ate the rest of the meal with whatever fork I pleased, he said. She laughed again, and he watched her laugh with something in his expression that was quiet and warm and very focused, and for the first time since the day he had put the deed on the counter, she felt the full weight of what was happening between them and was not afraid of it. She had liked him from the 2nd Sunday. She had begun to trust him from the 3rd. By the 6th, sitting in the doorway of Mrs. Pruitt's store with the rain coming down in silver sheets on Dusty Creek's main road, she knew with the particular clarity of a woman who has been careful about every step she takes that she was falling in love with Abel Hartwell and had been for some time. She did not say so yet. He did not either, but they both knew. On the 7th Sunday, Mrs. Pruitt excused herself pointedly to go visit her neighbor across the road, taking her knitting with her and leaving the store empty and the door open to the afternoon air. Alberta suspected collusion. She also didn't mind. Abel said, "I'd like you to see the homestead," she considered. That would require a chaperone or a commitment to propriety that a Sunday afternoon drive makes complicated. "I know," he said. "I could speak to Mrs. Pruitt about accompanying us, or you could invite whoever you'd like. I'm not in a hurry, Miss Vaughn. I just think you ought to see what you're being asked toward, since you reminded me once that the direction ought to suit you." He had remembered her exact words from the first day. She noted that carefully. "All right," she said. "Next Sunday, Mrs. Pruitt will come." Mrs. Pruitt agreed with a speed that confirmed Alberta's theory of collusion. The homestead on the South Fork of the Cimarron was exactly what Abel had described and also more than she had pictured. The house was whitewashed and solid, with a broad front porch and windows that caught the light, and inside it was clean and spare, and had the feeling of a place that had been built with intention rather than necessity alone. There was a kitchen with a good iron stove, a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, a small room with a window that faced east and had clearly been used as a study or a workroom of some kind. Outside, the barn was weathered but sound, and beyond it the south fork of the Cimarron caught the afternoon sun and ran clear over smooth stones through a fringe of cottonwood and willow. Mrs. Prout walked through the house with the air of a woman conducting an inspection, which she was, and pronounced the kitchen well appointed, and the bedroom floors admirably level. Alberta stood on the bank of the creek and listened to the water and felt the afternoon sun on her face and thought about a woman from Tennessee who had worked 12 years to make something like this, and then had it taken from her hands by a legal system that hadn't seen her in the papers. Abel came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "You love it." "I do. I've put everything I have into it." He paused. "But a place is just land without people in it." She turned to look at him and found him looking back, and there was nothing ambiguous in what passed between them in that moment. It was simply clear, the way good water is clear, the way a Kansas sky on a clean fall morning is clear. "Abel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. Something shifted in his expression. "Yes. I think you should know that I have been thinking about you every day since the Tuesday you put a deed on Mrs. Prout's counter." He was quiet for a moment that felt significant. "I've been thinking about you since the Tuesday before that," he said, "when I saw you carrying a crate of supplies from the freight wagon, and you wouldn't let old Mr. Dawes help you with it because you said you had it managed." She smiled at that. "I did have it managed." "You absolutely did," he agreed. "It was the most decided thing I'd ever seen." She looked back at the creek and then at the house and then at him. "I'm not ready to say yes to anything yet," she told him honestly, "but I want you to know that I'm not saying no either." "That's enough," he said simply. "That's more than enough, Mrs." Prout called from the porch that the sun was getting low and they had better think about starting back, and Alberta called back that they were coming, and Abel offered her his arm for the walk across the uneven ground to the house, and she took it, and it was the first time she had touched him, and it felt like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something that hadn't started yet. On the ride home in the wagon, with Mrs. Prout sitting between them with enormous satisfaction, and pretending to watch the landscape, Alberta thought about her life in Missouri, and the way it had narrowed year by year as her father's health declined, the way her own plans had contracted and contracted until there was nothing left but the next day's work and the next week's worry. She thought about coming west in a rail car with a carpet bag and a coin purse with $17 in it, which she'd considered either brave or reckless depending on the hour. She thought about 14 months of careful, solitary, purposeful work in Dusty Creek. She thought about the deed, still sitting in Abel's coat pocket, the deed he had offered her before she'd said yes to anything because he believed a woman should know what she was being offered before she decided whether to accept. She thought that was the most significant thing, not the 40 acres and the house and the creek and the good water, the thinking behind it, the man behind the thinking. 2 weeks later, on a warm June evening in 1878, Abel Hartwell arrived at the dry goods store at closing time with his hat in his hands and asked Alberta Vaughn if she would walk with him. They walked to the end of Dusty Creek's main road and turned south along the path that ran beside the creek there, the smaller town creek that was nothing like the one on his homestead but was pleasant in the evening with the shadows long and the birds settling into the cottonwoods. They walked in companionable silence for a few minutes, and then he stopped at a place where the path widened and turned to face her. "Alberta," he said. "Yes," she said, and then realized the word could be taken in multiple directions and felt her heart do something it had not done in a very long time. He saw it, she thought. He was a man who paid attention. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because I'm lonely, though I have been. Not because I need a woman on the homestead, though I could use the company. But because every Sunday afternoon for the last 9 weeks has been the best part of my week, and because you are the most honest person I've encountered in my adult life, And because the way you see things and the way you say what you see matches up in a way that I find remarkable in a person." He paused. "And because I think we would build a good life together. I think we would be good partners. And I think somewhere underneath all that I would love you very much, and I think I am partway there already." Alberta Vaughn stood in the long June evening light on the path beside Dusty Creek and felt something come loose in her chest, something she had held carefully bound for a long time, and found that she was not afraid of it being loose. "I have something to say first," she told him. "All right. I came to Dusty Creek to start over, to build something that was mine. I was not looking for a husband, Abel. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," he said. "But somewhere in the last 9 weeks I began looking at you and seeing someone I wanted to build a life alongside. Not because I'd given up on building my own, but because the idea of building one together seemed more interesting than building one alone." She met his eyes. "I think you understand that distinction." "I do," he said quietly. "And you are the kind of man who put a deed on a counter before you said a single romantic word, which tells me more about your character than anything you could have told me otherwise." He was watching her with an expression that was hope, carefully contained. "I am saying yes," Alberta told him. "I am saying yes to marrying you, Abel Hartwell, and I am saying it knowing what I'm saying yes toward and in which direction I'm headed, which is the only way I know how to say anything." He let out a breath, slow and quiet, and stepped toward her and took both of her hands in his and looked at her with those direct, unhurried brown eyes and said, "Thank you, Alberta. Not I'm so glad, not finally, not I knew you would. Just thank you," as though she had given him something rare. She thought she might cry and decided against it, at least until she was somewhere private. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it entirely. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the deed, the same folded document that had appeared on the counter between them 2 months before, and held it out to her. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. She took it this time. She held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, which was not the weight of paper but the weight of what paper represented, the legal right to the ground beneath your feet, the protection her name would give her, the security that Abel's mother had never had. "We'll have both our names on it," she said, "after the wedding." "Yes," he said, "that's what I want too." They stood there in the warm June evening until the sky turned from gold to rose to a deep, quiet violet, and then they walked back to town side by side, close enough that their arms sometimes touched, and Alberta held the folded deed in her hand all the way back to Mrs. Prutt's store, and she did not let go of it. Mrs. Prutt cried when they told her. She had clearly been expecting this news for several weeks, and had apparently prepared emotionally for it in advance, which accounted for the speed and completeness of her reaction. She embraced Alberta firmly and shook Abel's hand, and told him that he was a decent man, and she expected him to stay that way, which he accepted with the equanimity of someone being given a reasonable instruction. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of August 1878. There was enough time to do it properly, Alberta said, and enough time for her to write to her brother in St. Louis and to acquire a suitable dress, because she was going to be married once and she was going to do it right. Her brother Thomas wrote back with a letter that was warm and surprised in equal parts, and included a small sum of money as a wedding gift, along with the information that he and his wife hoped to come out for a visit the following year, once the baby they were expecting had arrived and was old enough to travel. Alberta read the letter 3 times and felt something soften around her brother that had been somewhat rigid since he'd let her come west without offering more help than a cousin's address and an encouraging word. People had their own lives and their own weights to carry, she knew. She wrote back and said she would be very glad to see them. Abel's neighbor, a broad-shouldered man named Clem Barker who had farmed the next parcel over for a decade, and was about as garrulous as a fence post, apparently showed a surprising amount of emotion when Abel told him. Clem came to the dry goods store the following week, bought a pound of coffee he almost certainly did not need, and told Alberta with great seriousness that Abel Hartwell was a man who kept his word and his fences, and she was getting a good one. Alberta thanked him with equal seriousness, and thought that was as fine a character reference as any. The summer of 1878 in Dusty Creek was hot and dry, and full of the particular kind of energy that a small western town generates when there is a wedding to anticipate. Mrs. Prout, who had no daughters of her own, threw herself into the preparations with a thoroughness that Alberta found both overwhelming and genuinely moving. There was discussion of flowers, of the church arrangement, of the wedding supper to be held in the community hall, of which of the neighboring women might be relied upon to contribute a dish, and which would contribute judgment while eating other people's food. Abel came to the store on Tuesday and Thursday evenings after that, and on those evenings they sat on the porch or walked the town road and talked about the homestead, about the cattle operation, about Alberta's plan to bring her bookkeeping skills to the financial side of the ranching business, which Abel received with undisguised relief, because he was a man who was very good with land and livestock, and somewhat less organized with figures and ledgers. "You've been keeping accounts with what?" she asked him one evening, looking through the papers he'd brought at her request. "Memory mostly," he admitted. "Abel, I have some paper records. I see the paper records. They appear to have been written during a windstorm." He had the grace to look slightly abashed, which on his particular face was not a very large expression but was genuinely there. "I know my own system," he said. "Your system," she told him, studying the papers, "would make a bank examiner weep, but I can fix it. I will need a proper ledger book in a month." "Done," he said immediately, with the relief of someone who has just been told that a problem they couldn't solve is going to be solved by someone else. She looked up at him and found him watching her with that expression again, the one that was warm and focused, and made her feel very specifically seen. She had decided she would never tire of it. "You're already running the homestead in your head," he observed. "I am," she agreed. "Is that all right?" "It's wonderful," he said simply. In the last week of July there was an incident that cast a brief shadow over the warmth of the summer. A man named Dale Pritchard, who worked for one of the larger cattle operations to the north, and who Alberta had encountered twice before in the store without particular incident, came into the dry goods on a Thursday morning while Mrs. Prout was there and Alberta was behind the counter, and made an unpleasant comment about a woman who would agree to marry a man without having been properly introduced through channels he considered appropriate, which Alberta understood to be a reference to the fact that she had come west alone and without a family to endorse her choices. She had met this kind of thinking before. It was the kind that dressed itself up as concern for propriety, when what it was, really, was a belief that women who made their own decisions had somehow done something wrong. She looked at Dale Pritchard across the counter with a steadiness she had been cultivating since the age of 16 and said, "I was introduced to my intended through the ordinary course of life in this town, Mr. Pritchard, and I find the channel perfectly satisfactory. Is there something I can help you purchase this morning, or were you planning to stand there and offer your opinions on my personal affairs?" Pritchard left without buying anything. Mrs. Prout from her chair by the window said, "Well done, my dear." Abel heard about it from Clem Barker, who had been at the feed store across the street and had a clear view through the window. He arrived at the dry goods that afternoon with a look on his face that Alberta recognized as restrained anger, which on Abel's calm features was visible primarily as a tightening around the jaw and a very deliberate quality to his movements. "Pritchard," he said. "I handled it," she told him. "I know you did. Clem told me word for word." He set his hat on the counter. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right." She looked at him. "Abel, I have been handling men like Dale Pritchard since before I came to Kansas. I am not fragile." "I know you're not. I'm asking anyway." She considered him. "I appreciate the asking," she said. "I do." but I need you to understand that my asking you to trust me to manage my own difficulties is not the same as not wanting your support. I want your support, I just don't need you to fight my fights." He absorbed this. "That is a fair distinction," he said after a moment. "Good." She turned back to the inventory she'd been doing. "Pritchard is not worth either of our attention." "Agreed," he said, and picked up his hat, and that was the end of that. She thought about it later, though, the ease with which he had heard what she'd said and accepted it. She had known men who would have argued with her about her own ability to handle her own life, who would have dressed up their unwillingness to take her at her word as protectiveness or concern. Abel had simply listened and adjusted, the way a man does who is genuinely interested in what you're telling him rather than in confirming what he already thought. It was not a small thing. She had learned early that the small things were often the large things in disguise. The first Saturday of August arrived with a sky so blue and vast it looked like something from a painting, and a dry warm breeze out of the southwest, and the smell of whatever wildflowers had survived the summer drought out along the creek bottoms. Dusty Creek's small white church was full to capacity, which in a town of 200 people meant roughly 40 individuals and one dog who had wandered in and been quietly redirected by the minister's wife. Alberta Vaughn walked into that church in a dress of ivory cotton that she and Mrs. Prout had made together over the previous 3 weeks, with small pearl buttons and a simple lace collar that had belonged to Mrs. Prout's own mother, and was offered with such genuine feeling that Alberta had accepted it with the understanding that it would be returned and kept safe. Her hair was down for the first time in Abel's presence, dark and long and pinned with small white flowers that Mrs. Prout's neighbor had grown in her kitchen garden. Abel stood at the front of the church in his good dark coat with his charcoal hat held in his hands, and when she came through the door, he turned and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the theatrical astonishment of a man performing for an audience. It was something quieter and more essential, a man seeing the thing he most wanted in the world walking toward him and being simply and completely moved by it. She held his eyes as she walked down the aisle, and she thought, "This is right. This is exactly right." The minister's name was Reverend Caleb Holt, a thin, earnest man who had been in Dusty Creek 3 years and had a gift for saying the essential thing without padding it. He spoke about partnership and honesty and the particular courage that it takes to build a life with another person, and Alberta thought he must have known Abel somewhat because he was describing something real rather than something ceremonial. When they spoke their vows, Abel's voice was steady and clear, and he held her hands as though they were something he intended to keep, and she said her own words back to him with the same directness she brought to everything, not performing feeling but expressing it, because she had decided some time ago that she loved him, and there was no point in being shy about it when the moment called for its acknowledgement. At the end of the ceremony, when Reverend Holt had pronounced them married, Abel kissed her with a gentleness that was also somehow completely sure of itself, and the church full of Dusty Creek applauded, including Clem Barker, who applauded with the concentrated energy of a man who doesn't do things by half. The wedding supper in the community hall lasted 3 hours and involved more food than Alberta had seen assembled in one place since a church fair in Missouri, and the fiddle player from the saloon, who had apparently been prevailed upon by community consensus, turned out to be genuinely excellent. And there was dancing, and Abel danced with the same focused, deliberate quality he brought to everything, which meant he was not showy about it, but he was very present. And Alberta danced with him and with Clem Barker and with Reverend Holt and once, memorably, with Mrs. Prout, who turned out to have been an accomplished dancer in her youth and still was, which was delightful to discover. At the end of the evening, Abel drove her out to the homestead in the wagon under a full August moon that turned the Kansas plain to silver, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench and felt the night air moving and the particular profound settledness of having arrived somewhere she'd been heading without quite knowing it. "Well," he said, when they could see the lights of the homestead house ahead, the lamp Abel had left burning. Well, she agreed. Alberta Hartwell, he said, trying the name out. She thought about that. She had been Alberta Vaughn for 24 years and the name had worn into the shape of her. I might keep Vaughn, she said. Alberta Vaughn Hartwell. If you don't mind. I don't mind at all, he said. Why would I? She leaned into his shoulder as the wagon rolled the last quarter-mile to the house, and he put his arm around her, and it was exactly right, exactly that simple and that complete. The first months on the homestead were a revelation in the practical sense and a joy in the personal one. Alberta had understood the shape of the cattle operation from Abel's descriptions over the summer, but understanding it in conversation and living inside it were different things. She threw herself into learning it with the same focused energy she brought to everything. She rode out with Abel in the mornings to check on the herd, learning to read the land and the cattle the way he could, learning the names he gave his horses and the qualities of each, learning which stretches of fence needed watching and which wells were reliable and which were not. The ledger books were her first campaign. She set up a proper accounting system within the first month and organized the homestead's financial records into something that could actually be read and used. And when Abel looked at the resulting organized columns and clear running totals, he said, with great sincerity, "This is a miracle." "It is basic bookkeeping," she told him. "It is a miracle compared to what I had before," he maintained, and she laughed. They cooked together in the evenings, or she cooked, and he helped with the parts he was actually competent at, which were primarily the carrying of things and the tending of the fire, and they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and talked, which she thought was perhaps the best discovery of the marriage, that they were good company for each other in the ordinary daily way that sustains a life. There was so much to talk about. They had begun to discover this on the Sunday afternoons, but the afternoon visits had been structured by time and propriety, while the evenings on the homestead were unlimited and entirely their own. They talked about the land and the cattle, about news from town, about books from Abel's small collection that they sometimes read aloud to each other in the sitting room after supper, about memories from their separate childhoods that had shaped them into the particular people they were. They did not always agree. When they disagreed, they were both direct about it and mostly found their way to a conclusion that made sense to both of them, and occasionally to an agreement that they simply saw something differently, and that was all right too. The autumn of 1878 came in sharp and clean, and with it came the first major challenge to the homestead's operations. A dry year meant the hay stores were lower than Abel had hoped, and there was genuine concern about winter feed for the herd. Abel spent 3 weeks negotiating with neighboring operations and making a trip to Caldwell to arrange for additional feed stock, and Alberta managed the homestead in his absence with a competence that apparently impressed Clem Barker, who came by twice to check, and each time found her fully in command of things, and said so to Abel on his return with the particular admiration of a man recalibrating an expectation. "Clem said you told the feed delivery driver that his weighing was off by 15 pounds and made him reweigh it," Abel reported. "It was off by 15 pounds, she said. He gave you an argument according to Clem." "He did. He lost it." She stirred the soup on the stove. "I have been keeping accounts since I was 16 years old, Abel. I know when a weight is off." He came behind her and kissed the side of her head with the easy, warm affection that had become characteristic of him as the marriage deepened, and the initial careful courtesy gave way to something more intimate and comfortable. "I know you do," he said. "I'm just enjoying the story." Winter came, and the homestead was solidly provisioned against it, and there were long, quiet evenings by the kitchen fire and the particular closeness that cold weather generates between two people living inside the same walls. Alberta discovered that Abel was a genuinely gifted carpenter, that he had built most of the furniture in the house himself, and she watched him work in the barn on winter projects with the same absorption she brought to her ledgers, both of them occupied and contented in ways that seemed to her fundamental to a good life. She also discovered that she was expecting a child by early December, which she told Abel at breakfast on a cold Tuesday morning with a directness that was characteristic of her, and that he received with a stillness that was characteristic of him, a long moment of apparent inability to locate his usual ease with words, followed by him reaching across the breakfast table and taking her hand and saying, "Alberta." "Yes," she said, smiling at him. "Are you well?" "I am very well. I'm going to be enormous by July, and I may become occasionally unreasonable about it, which I'd appreciate you accommodating without pointing it out." He laughed, and it was one of those laughs that was entirely genuine and uncontained, and he was still holding her hand when he said, "I am going to be a father." "You are," she confirmed. He sat with that for a moment, and she watched him taking it in, the weight and the wonder of it, and she thought that this was another of the essential things about him, the way he truly felt things rather than performing the feeling of them. "My father would have loved you," he said then, quietly. "Tell me about him." He did. That morning over breakfast and later by the fire that evening, he told her about his father, William Hartwell, a Tennessee man who had come west with dreams that were large and rough-edged, and who had built something real from them, who had been funny and difficult and deeply kind in the specific way of people who don't announce their kindness, who had loved Abel's mother in a way that was evident in every story Abel told, even though William Hartwell had apparently never been a man given to declarations. "He just showed up," Abel said. "Every time something was hard, he just showed up and did what needed doing. That's how I knew he loved her." Alberta thought about the deed on the counter, the first day and the Sunday afternoons and the dancing at the wedding, and Abel appearing at the dry goods after the Pritchard incident not to fight but to ask if she was all right. She thought about a man who had taught his son what love looked like by example rather than instruction. "He did a good job," she said softly. Abel looked at the fire. "I hope I do too," he said. She moved from her chair to sit beside him on the settee, and leaned into his shoulder the way she had in the wagon on their wedding night, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the firelight in the sound of the winter wind, outside the walls of the house he had built back from the hands that had tried to take it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The spring of 1879 arrived with a spectacular recklessness of wildflowers, the kind of spring that comes after a hard winter as though to make amends. And Alberta, round and magnificent with 6 months of pregnancy, walked the homestead in the mornings cataloging the wildflowers along the creek bank with an attention to their variety and color that she hadn't expected to feel. She had not been particularly focused on the natural world before, being a practical person with practical concerns, but something about being inside a life that was going to expand again in July made the spring world seem urgently worth noticing. She kept a small journal that spring, which she had not done before, recording the progress of the homestead and the domestic details and also her own thoughts, which she found useful to write down because writing clarified them. She wrote about Abel and about the homestead and about the child coming, but she also wrote about bigger things, about the way the West was changing around them even in the short time she'd been here, about the railroad routes pressing further in, and the way they brought both opportunity and disruption, about the homesteaders coming out from the East in increasing numbers and the complicated question of what that meant for the land, and for the people who had been on it before any white settler's deed had ever been filed. The Comanche and Kiowa peoples whose presence and whose dispossession were part of the very ground she now walked on. She wrote about this in her journal because she thought it was important to look at directly. The deed in her name and Abel's name represented something real and something protected, but it was protected by a legal system that had only recently acknowledged the existence of her own rights, and that had spent decades systematically undermining the rights of others in ways she could not simply not notice. Abel, when she spoke about this one evening, nodded slowly and said that he'd thought about it too, that there was a weight to the land that wasn't just the soil and the water, and that a person could honor what they'd built without closing their eyes to the cost of how the building had been made possible. She loved him for that. She loved him for a great many things, but that in particular, the willingness to look at complexity and not retreat from it into simple comfort. In June of 1879, Alberta's brother Thomas and his wife Clara arrived from St. Louis with their 5-month-old daughter, who was called Margaret and was a round, startled-looking person with strong opinions about everything. Thomas Vaughn was 30 years old and looked enough like Alberta to confirm the relation immediately, and had the slightly overwhelmed air of a man who had been living a city life and had just encountered 40 Kansas acres in the full heat of a summer noon. Abel met them at the station in Dusty Creek and drove them out to the homestead, and Alberta watched from the porch as the wagon came up the road, and felt a complicated warmth that was partly joy at seeing her brother and partly pride in what she had built, and partly the simple human pleasure of being seen in your own place by someone from your before place. Thomas shook Abel's hand with the air of a man conducting a careful assessment, and Abel submitted to it with equable patience, and by the second evening, they were sitting on the porch after supper talking about cattle and grain prices and the reliability of the Kansas railroads with the ease of men who have decided to like each other. Clara Vaughn was a quick, bright woman who had clearly been very curious about Alberta's Western life and had arrived with a list of questions she worked through methodically over the course of the visit, and who held little Margaret on her lap and watched Alberta with an expression that was admiring and perhaps slightly envious of the openness of the horizon in every direction. "You look happy," Clara told her one afternoon while they were sitting on the porch in the shade and the men were walking the south pasture. "I am happy," Alberta said simply. "I wasn't sure when you came west. Tom was very worried." Alberta looked at her. "Tom didn't offer to come and worry in person." Clara had the grace to acknowledge this with a slight expression of agreement. "He felt he should stay. The business, the apartment. I think he also thought you were too stubborn to need help." "I was too stubborn to need help," Alberta said. "That doesn't mean it wouldn't have been nice to be offered it." There was a pause. "He knows," Clara said quietly. "I think he knows." Alberta looked at the south pasture where she could see the two men moving, Abel's broader figure pointing at something, and Thomas looking where he pointed. She thought about 14 months alone in Dusty Creek, about the carpetbag and the $17 and the cousin's address. She thought about how things could have gone differently and how they hadn't, and decided that holding the past carefully was less useful than acknowledging it and moving forward. "It's all right," she told Clara. "We're here now. That's what matters." A week into the visit, Thomas Vaughn found Alberta alone in the kitchen one morning and sat down at the table with the particular deliberateness of a man preparing to say something he'd been working up to. "Abel showed me the deed yesterday," he said. "Our names on it together." "Yes," she said. "He offered it to you before you'd agreed to anything. Is that true?" Mrs. Prout told Clara. "It is true," Alberta said, putting down the coffee pot and looking at her brother. "Before I'd said yes to anything, before I'd said yes to courtship even." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual man." "He is," she agreed. "That's why I married him." Her brother nodded slowly. "You knew what you were doing," he said. "Coming out here, I wasn't sure at the time." "I knew I was going somewhere," she said. "I didn't know the destination yet, but that's all right. Sometimes you just have to start moving." He reached across the table and took her hand briefly, a gesture so like their father that her throat tightened for a moment. "I'm glad it worked out," he said simply. "So am I," she told him. Thomas and Clara left for St. Louis on a Thursday morning in late June, with Margaret asleep against Clara's shoulder, and promised to return the following year, and Alberta watched the wagon to the road and felt both the gentle ache of their going and the return of the homestead's particular quiet, which she had come to love. On a Thursday evening in late July 1879, Alberta went into labor. Abel sent Clem Barker to fetch Mrs. Prout, who arrived with the practical speed of a woman who had been mentally preparing for this moment, and who had done this before and was not frightened of it, along with a neighbor woman named Ida Greer, who was a practical nurse, and whose presence Abel had arranged months in advance because he was a man who thought about contingencies. Abel spent the labor in the kitchen because Mrs. Prout had directed him there firmly, and he spent it doing what he'd apparently determined was the best use of his time, which was being ready for whatever was needed: coffee and water and additional wood on the fire. And Clem Barker sat with him for company, and they spoke very little and drank a great deal of coffee. At 4 in the morning on a Friday in July 1879, Alberta von Hartwell delivered a son, healthy and loud, and possessed from the first moment of an indignant quality, as though he'd had opinions about the timing and wished to register them. Ida Greer called Abel in, and he came through the door and looked at Alberta, who was tired in a way that was below words, and at the child in her arms, and his face did that thing she had come to love, the thing where the feeling was too large for his expression to contain it all at once, and came through instead in stages. He sat beside her on the bed and looked at the baby, who had stopped yelling and was examining the lamplight with the focused intensity of someone encountering something new. "He's real," Abel said. "He is extremely real," Alberta confirmed. "He has been making himself known for the last 7 hours." Abel looked at his son and then at his wife, and the expression he wore was one she would keep in memory for the rest of her life: complete and absolute tenderness, without armor, without any of the careful management of feeling that men in her experience sometimes applied to emotions that felt too large for public display. "What shall we call him?" Abel asked quietly. They had discussed names theoretically, but had not committed, both feeling that a name should meet the person. Alberta looked at the baby, who was looking at the lamp with that intense, slightly aggrieved focus. "William," she said, "after your father." Abel went very still. "If that's all right," she said. "That's," he began and stopped. "Yes, William." William Hartwell slept for the first time in the early light of the Friday morning, while his parents sat together on the bed with their shoulders touching and the homestead quiet around them. And in Dusty Creek, Mrs. Prout rode home in the dawn with the kind of satisfaction that belongs to a person who has seen something important beginning. The years that followed were full. They were full in the way that lives are full when they are being actually lived, not performed for an audience but inhabited directly, with all the ordinary and extraordinary things that entails. The cattle operation grew steadily through the early 1880s. Alberta's accounting and financial management became so integral to the business that she was effectively running the financial side entirely, which she found deeply satisfying. And she also began helping neighboring homesteaders with their accounts, charging a modest fee and providing a service that turned out to be considerably in demand in a region where many people were land-rich and numeracy poor. Abel extended the barn in 1880 and built an additional room onto the house, a proper study for Alberta with shelves for books and a good desk facing the east window, which she received with emotion that surprised her a little, and that Abel accepted without comment, simply touching her shoulder and going back to his work. They had their disagreements over the years, real ones about real things, about the amount of credit to extend to the operation in a dry year, about whether to expand the herd when Abel thought the timing was right, and Alberta thought they should wait another season, about larger things occasionally, about how they wanted to live and what they wanted for William and what they valued. They were both direct people, and they argued directly and resolved things directly, and there was never a disagreement that altered the fundamental orientation they had toward each other. Clem Barker came to supper at the homestead so regularly through the years that he became effectively family, the bachelor neighbor who ate at their table on Sundays, and who became the kind of steady presence in William's childhood that a child is lucky to have. The person who taught him things Abel didn't think to teach, because they were so natural to him that he forgot they needed teaching. In 1882, Mrs. Prout retired from the dry goods store and sold the business and moved to live with her sister in Abilene, and Alberta went to see her off at the station in Dusty Creek and held the old woman's hands and thanked her for the lace collar and the rocking chair on the porch and the knitting needles that had clicked through so many Sunday afternoons. "You were always going to be all right," Mrs. Prout told her. "I just wanted to make sure you knew it." Alberta kissed her cheek and put her on the train and watched it go south and east until it was a thread of smoke on the horizon. And then she rode back to the homestead in the afternoon heat and found Abel and William repairing fence in the south pasture. And she stopped the horse and watched them for a moment, the man and the boy working in the easy silence of people who are comfortable together, and thought about a woman from Tennessee who had worked 12 years and ended her days taking in washing, and thought about the deed that now bore 2 names in the county records office, and thought about the precise weight of a document folded in a coat pocket and placed on a counter before anything had been decided. In the summer of 1883, Alberta discovered she was expecting their second child, and this time she told Abel in the evening on the porch with William asleep inside and the stars very thick overhead. And Abel laughed the uncontained laugh she loved and said, "William is going to have a great deal to say about this." William did have a great deal to say about it. He was 4 years old and his opinions were comprehensive on all subjects. He was largely in favor of a sibling. Contingent on certain conditions, he articulated with remarkable specificity for someone whose second language was complete sentences. Their daughter was born in February of 1884, during a Kansas winter storm that tested Ida Greer's horsemanship, getting to the homestead and Abel's nerve waiting in the kitchen a second time. She arrived in the small hours, quieter than her brother had been, with dark hair like Alberta's and brown eyes that looked, when they first focused, directly at her father with an expression of calm assessment that Abel said afterward reminded him strongly of the first time Alberta had looked at him across a dry goods counter. "She is going to be particular," he said. "She absolutely is," Alberta agreed with satisfaction. They named her Ruth. Ruth Hartwell looked at the world from her first days with the careful observational quality of a person who is gathering information before forming conclusions. And Abel and Alberta watched this with equal parts amusement and recognition. William took his role as elder sibling with great seriousness and occasional bossiness that Alberta corrected with more patience than it deserved. And Clem Barker fashioned Ruth a small rocking horse for her first Christmas that she examined with the same careful assessment she brought to everything before declaring it acceptable. The middle of the 1880s were the best years of the homestead. The cattle operation was solid and well managed. The accounts were organized and showed a steady and growing picture of financial health. The house was full of children and books, and the comfortable noise of a life being actively inhabited. Abel had built additional shelves in Alberta's study for the growing book collection, and on winter evenings they still read to each other by the fire, sometimes with William listening with his chin on his hand, and sometimes with Ruth asleep in his lap, despite his official protests that she was too heavy. In the fall of 1885, Abel rode into Dusty Creek one October afternoon and came home with a letter that had arrived at the post office for Alberta, and her face when she read it told him something significant was in it before she said anything. It was from a man named Gerald Watts, a lawyer in Columbia, Missouri, who had been managing the estate of a woman named Harriet Clements, who had died in the spring, and who had been, as Alberta explained to Abel that evening, the unmarried aunt of her mother's who had lived quietly in Columbia on a small income, and had visited them twice when Alberta was young, and had been kind, and had smelled of lavender, and had given Alberta a small silver brooch on her 10th birthday. Harriet Clements had left her estate in equal portions to Alberta and Thomas, which amounted, in practical terms, to $1,100 each. $1,100 in 1885 was a significant sum. It was not a fortune, but it was freedom of a particular kind, the kind that means options exist that didn't before. Alberta sat with the letter for 2 days, thinking, before she talked to Abel about what she wanted to do with it. She wanted to expand the bookkeeping service. She had been providing accounts management for neighboring homesteaders informally for 5 years, and the demand had grown, and she had an idea about formalizing it into a proper service with an office in Dusty Creek and the capacity to serve more clients with more comprehensiveness. She wanted to use $500 to establish it properly, an office space, a second ledger book set, a proper sign on the door. Abel listened to this plan with complete attention and then said, "Tell me about the other 600. Reserve," she said, "held against dry years and unexpected costs." He nodded. "The bookkeeping service is a good idea. It's been a good thing for 5 years already. Do you have concerns about it?" "Yes," he said. She waited. "I'm concerned about your time," he said. "You already manage our accounts and the house and the children and the cattle schedules. Adding a formal business with multiple clients means more hours." "I know," she said. "I've thought about that. I think we need to hire someone to help with the cattle records specifically, which would free up my time for the expanded service. The income from the service should more than cover the hire within a year." He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has been presented with an argument he finds entirely reasonable and is simply catching up to it. "You've worked all this out," he said. "I have been thinking for 2 days," she said. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." The bookkeeping office opened in Dusty Creek in the spring of 1886, in a small space, next to the new dry goods store that had replaced Mrs. Pruitt's. The sign on the door said HARTWELL, accounts in plain black letters, and within 3 months, Alberta had 6 regular clients and a waiting list of 2 more. She rode to town 3 days a week and sometimes 4, which required rearranging the household schedule with the kind of logistical precision she brought to everything. And Abel took on more of the morning domestic work without being asked, which was noted and appreciated. William was 7 by then, and Ruth was 2, and William had developed a passionate interest in horses that Abel cultivated carefully, teaching him the gradations of horsemanship with the same patience he brought to everything he genuinely cared about. Ruth had begun to talk in complete, deliberate sentences and to follow Alberta around the house and the office with the focused attention of a person who is learning something she intends to use later. "She watches everything you do," Abel told Alberta one evening. "I know," Alberta said. "She watched you go through the Barker accounts this afternoon, and her face looked exactly the way yours looks when you're finding an error." Alberta smiled at that. "She is 4 years old." "She's your daughter," he said, as if that explained both everything and nothing. In the summer of 1887, a drought came to the Cimarron country that was the worst in a decade. The creek ran low, and the pastures went brown and brittle, and there were real decisions to be made about the herd and the future of the operation. Alberta sat across from Abel at the kitchen table, with both their heads bent over the ledger books for 3 evenings in a row, working through the numbers with the careful attention of people who have maintained good records, and can therefore see clearly what their situation actually is, rather than what they fear or hope it might be. The picture was not catastrophic. They had the reserves. They could reduce the herd to a sustainable number and carry through to the following spring. It would be a hard winter, but not a ruinous one. Abel sold 40 head at the Caldwell market in September at prices that were, given the market conditions, fair enough, and he came home from Caldwell tired and dusty and sat down at the table while Alberta put supper on and said, "We're all right." "I know," she said. "I ran the figures again this morning." "Of course you did," he said. She put a plate in front of him and sat across from him and said, "Abel." He looked up. "You are not your father," she said. "And this is not 1871. I want you to know that. What happened to your parents is not going to happen to us." He was quiet for a moment. She had understood over the years that the fear lived in him sometimes, the specific fear that the thing built could be taken away, that the security he had reconstructed from the wreckage of his childhood could prove as fragile as his mother's had been. "I know," he said finally. "Do you?" "When you say it," he said, "yes." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Both our names are on the deed, she said. The accounts are in order. We know exactly where we stand. No one can take this from us. He turned his hand over and held hers. No, he said, they can't. The drought broke in October, which was late but not too late, and the autumn rains came steady and thorough, and the creek came back up to its proper level, and the remaining herd went into winter in better condition than they'd feared. The homestead survived as it had always survived, because it had been built with intention and managed with care, and because the people inside it faced things directly and together. Thomas and Clara came west again in 1888, with Margaret, now 9 years old, and a second child, a boy named Henry who was 6, and who arrived on the Kansas plain with an expression of absolute wonder that made Abel laugh and immediately take him to see the horses, which was clearly the right decision. The two families spent a week together on the homestead, noisy and crowded and full of children running between the barn and the creek and the house. And Alberta stood on the porch one afternoon watching Thomas walk the south pasture with Abel, both men talking easily, Thomas gesturing at something on the horizon and Abel nodding. And she thought about the distance she had covered since Missouri, not the miles but the other kind, the distance between who she had been expected to be and who she had become. She had not lost herself in the becoming. She was still practical and direct and particular. She still kept the accounts and read at the east window in the morning and held opinions about the proper management of things and stated those opinions without apology. She had simply added to herself, had grown in the way that happens when you find the right soil. On the last evening of Thomas's visit, after the children were in bed and Clara had gone in as well, the two siblings sat on the porch in the dark with the sound of the plain around them, the insects and the wind and the far-off sound of cattle. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked. He had asked this before and she had answered before, but tonight it felt like a different question, or perhaps the same question asked from a different place. "I am," she said, "genuinely, specifically, completely happy, not without difficulty or worry or hard seasons, but happy in the root of it." Thomas was quiet. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," he said. "When you first left, I should have helped more." "You had your own life," she said. "That's not a good enough reason," he said. "I've thought about it since. You came west alone with almost nothing, and I let you go because it was easier." She looked at her brother, who was 40 now and had his father's set to his jaw, and she thought more of his father's capacity for honesty than he'd shown in the years when they were both young and frightened of the future. "I would have gone anyway," she told him. "You know that." "I know," he said, "but I should have come with you at least to Dusty Creek, made sure you were settled." "Then I might not have learned to be settled on my own," she said. "And being settled on my own is part of why I'm good at this life, Thomas. It's part of why I knew what I was saying yes to when I said it." He looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You have always been smarter than me." "In different ways," she said generously. He laughed, and it was a laugh that had some of their father in it, and they sat in the sound of the Kansas night, and it was all right between them, as it had been before, even when it was complicated, and as it would be from here. Abel appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, having apparently determined that the porch conversation was ongoing and deserved refreshment, and handed them each one and settled into the third chair with his own cup, and the 3 of them sat there in the evening for another hour, talking about nothing consequential and everything important. Thomas's family went back to St. Louis on a September morning, with hugs and promises, and Henry Vaughn announcing that he intended to come back and ride the horses when he was older, which Abel told him with complete seriousness was an open invitation. The autumn of 1888 came in with a sweetness that Alberta marked in her journal as distinct, the light particularly clear and the creek particularly full after a good summer, and the cottonwoods going gold along the banks. William was 9 years old and Ruth was 4, and the homestead was in the best condition it had ever been in, the accounts healthy, the house solid, the barn rebuilt and expanded in the spring, the fence along the south pasture entirely replaced. Alberta stood at the bank of the South Fork Creek on an October afternoon, while William was in school in Dusty Creek, and Abel was riding the fence line, and Ruth was in the house with Ida Greer's daughter, who had come to help 2 days a week. And she looked at the water running clear over the smooth stones, and at the gold and green of the cottonwood fringe, and at the blue sky that went on past comprehension in every direction. She thought about a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and a sound like a pistol shot, and a folded paper on a dry goods counter. She thought about a man who had understood what it was to have something taken from someone who deserved to keep it, and who had determined, before he had said a single word about love, that the woman he was going to love would be protected from that possibility. She thought about the deed that was now properly recorded in both their names in the county records office, the deed that represented not just the land and the water and the house and the 40 good acres, but a belief that Abel had carried since he was old enough to understand what had happened to his mother, a belief that a woman's claim on her life should be written into the paper of it, should have the full legal weight of the world behind it. She had built this life out of a carpetbag and $17, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided she was going to be particular. She had built it alongside a man who had understood from the beginning that building alongside was different from building over, that a partner was someone whose name belonged on the deed. The creek ran on in its clear way, and the cottonwoods shook their gold leaves into the water, and the sky stayed enormous, and the wind moved through the grass of the south pasture, with the sound that she would always, ever afterward, associate with home. She heard hoofbeats and turned, and Abel was coming back along the fence line on his gray horse, his charcoal hat set squarely on his head, and she raised a hand and he raised his, and turned the horse toward the creek, and she watched him come and felt the old, long, settled thing in her chest that was love, not the bright, urgent kind of the beginning, but the deep kind, the kind that had been tested by droughts and difficult seasons, and the ordinary daily weight of a life shared honestly. He dismounted at the creek bank and let the horse drink and came to stand beside her. He did not say anything immediately. Neither did she. The creek ran between them and the day, and neither of them felt any need to fill the quiet with words. Then he said, "Ruth has decided she wants to learn to read the accounts." Alberta looked at him. "She is 4 years old. She is a very particular 4-year-old, he said, with a particular expression that meant he found this both amusing and absolutely understandable. "She was sitting at your desk in the study with the ledger book open when I came in for water, looking very serious." "What did you say?" "I said that was her mother's book and she should ask before she opened it, and she said she would ask when her mother came back, and then she kept looking at the ledger." Alberta smiled. "Good." Abel looked at the creek and then at her. "She is exactly like you," he said, and the way he said it was not a complaint or a concern. It was a statement of deep satisfaction, the same satisfaction that was in his voice whenever he talked about his daughter's particular quality of focused observation, the way she moved through the world gathering information and forming conclusions. "I hope she is," Alberta said. "She is. And William is going to be a good horseman. Better than me already in some ways. He has a feel for it." He paused. "We made good people, Alberta." She felt the truth of it in the particular way that truth lands when it is also love. "We did," she said. He held out his hand and she took it, and they stood at the bank of the South Fork of the Cimarron on an October afternoon in 1888, with the gold light coming through the cottonwoods and the water running clear, and the homestead behind them solid and real and entirely their own. The years ahead were already taking shape in the way that years do when you are inside a life you have chosen and built, and that holds. The kind of shape that includes more work and more seasons, and more of the ordinary daily texture of things. William growing toward the kind of man who would take the south pasture in hand with the confidence of someone who has always known it was his. Ruth growing toward the kind of woman who would open the ledger books and see what was in them and know what to do next. Both of them carrying forward things that had been built from scratch and held through difficulty and been worth every bit of the difficulty. There would be more drought years and good years, More letters from Thomas and visits from family. More Sunday evenings on the porch with Clem Barker. More winter evenings with books and firelight, and the sound of two people who are good company for each other in the long, ordinary stretch of time. There would be the particular joy of watching children become people, and of finding, in the people they became, the best of what had been put into them. And there would be always this: a woman who had been careful and particular and exact about what she wanted, and a man who had understood before he said a single romantic word that what she deserved was to know what she was being offered, and to have her name on the paper, and the deed between them that had started all of it, the deed placed on a counter before she had said yes to anything, the extraordinary, strange, right first gesture of a man who thought about what love should look like before he asked anyone to live inside it. Alberta Vaughn Hartwell stood at the creek bank in the October light and held her husband's hand and listened to the water, and she thought that a life, when it is built right, does not feel like something that happened to you. It feels like something you made. It feels like yours. She squeezed his hand once, deliberate and warm, and Abel Hartwell squeezed back without looking away from the creek, and the cottonwoods shed their gold leaves into the current, and the plains stretched on in every direction under the enormous and endless Kansas sky.